All right, our first question I think is for Dr. Hatfield. Is it possible or responsible to move away from monoculture? And if so, what would be the first step in doing so?
I'll go back and finish with Jerry's comment in terms of transfer payments. You look at this in terms of what it would take to move away from monoculture, and what drives most of those decisions is economics. If corn and soybean production become much more risky, in which producers are losing money, they're going to be looking at alternatives as part of this process. And I'll give you an example of this very, very quickly. Working with the state of Kentucky right now, looking at, they grow a lot of corn in Kentucky, but they also grow wheat, and it's well adapted there. But their corn production is becoming more risky because their soils are poor. You see on that one graph where I had the different soil indices, theirs were down at the bottom of that spectrum. So the combination of low water holding capacity, less summer rainfall, corn production has become quite risky. And so as a state, they've really looked at saying, what can we do to promote wheat growth and wheat production across that? And so I think that's what it's going to take, you know, and all of this in terms of different dynamics. And these are not going to be easy decisions at times, but I think economics will dictate a lot of change very, very quickly.
Jerry, one thing that I pointed out in a recent editorial about agriculture is that you may have seen in March, Walmart decided that they're going to do supply chain certification on presumably the entire supply chain for soy, wheat, and maize products. And Cargill and Kellogg already signed up, I think, to agree to do that. Do you think that's a way that we could change agricultural behavior?
Yeah, it's. I look at the time because that's a 45-minute talk on that process. But there's a great. This is a fascinating change right now, and Jerry points it out. And I didn't want to talk too much about that, but this whole issue of the sustainability of the supply chain. That's why we've been focusing on the soil resource as part of this. We really do underestimate just our impact on our soil resource for Iowa, and the fact that we are increasing our risk profile by our degradation aspect of this. And so when you got companies like Walmart, General Mills, ADM, Kellogg, and I've been in conversations with them. They've asked me to put together some pretty unique pieces of how do we start looking at agriculture of the future with this combination of climate change and cropping patterns and everything else. That's why I say it's a 45-minute talk to lay all these pieces out. But agriculture is in the midst of a revolution, and some of us are really stoking the fires of the revolution. I think that's what it's going to take. You know, and we piece all these information together to do that. But I think it will drive a lot of change very, very quickly.
Our next question is, are farmers beginning to understand these climatic change issues?
Oh, yeah. Well, farmers have always understood climate change issues. It's a matter of, the debate is not about the impact of climate change on them. It's the debate where it gets into, is it totally human caused, or is it natural cycles, and, you know, all of this. And so if you can get it away from that polarizing debate and put it into the discussion of what are you going to do to adapt, because what I really tell them is that irregardless of whether humans are totally responsible or it's this combination of everything, is that how are you going to farm in the future when the weather becomes more variable? And I focus on that particular discussion because that hits them where they make a decision.
Wanda, our next question is for you.
Okay.
How has your work at the State Hygienic Lab been impacted by budget cuts, and what are you no longer able to do?
Oh boy, how long do we have?
It's the 45-minute talk, right?
Well, yeah, I've only been there since 2011, but kind of let me explain the basis of our funding. We have two emergency preparedness funding streams nationally. One is called the Hospital Preparedness Program. The second is called the Public Health Emergency Preparedness Program. They are funneled through the Department of Health and Human Services to the CDC, to the state. And then, for example, on the public health side, the money is shared between the State Hygienic Lab, the State Health Department, and then our local public health departments. Hospital preparedness, we used to get a little funding for that, but that's mainly shared with the hospitals. So in the heyday of emergency preparedness after 9/11 and the 2001 anthrax attacks, I believe our funding in 2004, 2005 was around $2 million. It's been going down. We're at about $1.45 million. We don't have any hospital preparedness funds anymore. This current budget period coming up in July, the hospital preparedness program has been cut for the state by 39%. Remember what I talked about with Joplin and a hospital taking a direct hit? Not the way to cut money. As far as what we can't do anymore, certain things such as trainings for our Sentinel or our hospital/clinical laboratories. We've had decrease in staffing. We've had a lot of turnover in staffing because some of the requirements from the CDC are quite burdensome to our staff members. They have to go through personnel reliability programs to make sure that they're suitable for the agents that they handle. I'm not able to travel as much through the state of Iowa, and that's hard for me because one of my friends at Iowa Homeland Security, Steve Warren, he always says, during a disaster is not the time to be handing out business cards. You want to have these relationships established ahead of time. So, we keep plugging along, and we're still able to maintain the program, but it's just a lot of the extras that we're not able to do with the trainings and travel, et cetera.
A follow-up question for you, Wanda.
Oh, okay.
So potentially in light of these more extreme events that are certainly occurring, what can we as individuals help to prepare ourselves?
Oh, very good question. One of the things I always preach to my friends, and they get tired of me sending stuff to them, especially this time of year with extreme weather in Iowa, such as tornadoes, make a kit, make a preparedness kit. 1 gallon of water for each person in your family per day. Have your go kit, and don't forget your pets as well. You never know when you're going to have to evacuate, and basically plan that you can be self-sufficient for 3 days. So that's enough food and water, medicines. If you have infants, of course, formula, diapers, things like that, and also just be aware. FEMA has a lot of interesting tutorials on personal preparedness. One of our nonprofit agencies in the state called Safeguard Iowa has a program called 20 Weeks to Preparedness. So if you feel overwhelmed as far as, oh no, what am I going to need for my go kit or my preparedness kit, they actually have a brochure that every week you can go get something. In 20 weeks you're going to have your complete preparedness kit. So that's my advice. Make sure that you're able to be self-sustaining for 3 days.
Thank you. Our next question pertains to Iowa's soil resource. So how do you improve soils to mitigate the effects of climate change and their effects on agriculture, particularly to prevent crop declination?
I'll share this question with Jerry because, he did a perfect segue with the SWOT model and erosion, because as we do erode our soils, we lose organic matter out of that, because that's where the piece we're eroding. If you look at this, there's a linear relationship between organic matter content and water holding capacity. So the more organic matter we put into that soil, the more water we can hold. It also has other attributes that are positive for plant growth. But the thing that we have to do to begin to improve our soil resource is to store more carbon. And here's the dramatic part of this whole process is that plants during the whole summer are sequestering carbon, and they're putting it into that root zone and all of this. But then in the fall, when we till that soil, we take most of that carbon and we put it right back in the atmosphere in a short period of time. And so that's why it's hard for us to build up organic matter unless we go to no-till, conservation tillage, a number of different things that have to be associated with this. I drove across last night, and you get in east of Newton, and you look across those fields and you see all those little rills that have occurred. And we really have not had any of those 4-inch rains that Jerry talked about very much this spring, and yet we've already have erosion across this. But the other piece is our soils have become so fragile that they hardly handle an inch of rainfall before we start seeing runoff out of them as well. And so you start seeing what we've done to our landscape. We've increased its vulnerability to the more and more conditions that Jerry is talking about. So we end up with more erosion under less extreme rainfall events. And so that becomes a major concern to me. So we need to maintain that residue on the surface. We need to continue to sequester that carbon. The whole issue with cover crops and changing our aspect, begin to increase the carbon back into that. We're spending we have a whole program going on right now across the United States. It's NRCS has got their soil health program. There's another group that's working on what we call soil renaissance. We thought we'd go with a real catchy name. And how do we improve our soil resources, because our agriculture and our future depends upon that soil resource. So.
I don't have much to add. We've lost, Jerry, maybe half of our soil since pre-settlement time, and I think there have been some good behavioral changes, conservation tillage. I can remember when I was a boy growing up in Iowa that you'd see moldboard plowing even in the wintertime, and there is more participation in conservation and no-till, but the crop cover and the intensity of yields now mean we continue to put on more and more chemicals, and it requires also some tillage, and that loses soil for us. And as Jerry said, when you lose soil, it means that everything else is more vulnerable in the crop production system, and we see that in the models as well.
We have a related question about cover crops, and so how can these be used effectively in Iowa? What types of crops might be used?
You want to start with that?
Well, as you know, we do have a nice program. Is it $25 an acre, I think,
Yep.
that and it got used up right away this year. So farmers are interested in doing this, and it's, again, extra work for them, although rye is one that's popular, and you can do various things with the rye if you plant it in the winter time, and including just disking it in for soil productivity or harvesting and feeding the animals. But it does help protect the crop during that critical time that we were talking about, when there's no canopy cover, and if you get a intense rainfall event, then you're going to lose a lot of soil. But to their credit, farmers are very interested in it. It's a very popular state program, I think, right now, and that's encouraging.
And let me just add to that. I mean, cover crops really are a fantastic opportunity for us from not only an erosion protection, but also a soil rebuilding exercise in terms of putting carbon back into that soil. Think about them as a carbon capture device. But they're also nitrogen capture devices, because 2,000 pounds of rye out there is going to take about 40 pounds of nitrogen and put it into plant material. So we'll end up with less nitrate, so we'll improve water quality, both from a sediment viewpoint as well as a leaching viewpoint. A number of different things that happen simultaneously, because we really underestimate the impact that we've had by going to a corn soybean system. The nitrate levels that we see in the Raccoon River and the Cedar Rapids River that have increased over time are not due to increasing fertilizer application. They're really the fact that we've taken small grains of hay out of that rotation that take water and hold that nitrogen early in the season. So there's a number of different dynamics that are going on in this process.
And agriculture sure is a popular topic
Oh, yeah.
in Iowa. Our next question is along the same line, so I'd like to pose that now, and it has to do with the use of annual crops versus perennial crops. So recognizing that corn is an annual crop that has shallow roots and takes months to mature, are there other perennial crops, potentially such as hazelnuts, that might serve a function of helping to preserve that soil resource?
Oh yeah, I mean any time that you can go back and look at perennials. In fact, I think that's one of the things that Jerry and the cohorts have done in the SWOT model, is start looking at how do you manipulate the landscape in terms of putting perennial crops into that, because you basically have got something that's growing and it's got a permanent root system. It's taking up water, it's taking up nutrients, but it also is doing all these different dynamics to the system. And so when you look at what we change across this by going to much more perennial vegetation, properly placed on the landscape, we could have tremendous impacts, positive impacts on our soil resource, our water quality resource, health benefit from a standpoint of changing the dynamics. And actually we got a program looking at linkages to health right now, in saying when you start doing these things, you really have and I use the term multifunctionality of the landscape, because you got a water quality benefit, you've got a production benefit, you've got a environmental quality, you actually got a human benefit. All of these different things are going on simultaneously, and we're going to have to refocus how we think about these things in that perspective. And it's not just a production viewpoint, but all the other tangents that hit with it. So,
May I add that I agree completely, and we need more commodity crops that earn income for farmers that are perennial. And it could include, I'll give a shout out here to Furman Milster with the University of Iowa Sustainability group, because we're growing miscanthus now here for eventual burning in our power plant in lieu of coal, which has multiple benefits, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, saving on the cost of coal, and miscanthus is a perennial grass which grows very fast and can be harvested periodically. Willow and poplar, cellulosic crops, switchgrass, for cellulosic ethanol would be a good idea too. And we haven't been able to break through on that. But as you know, 40% of our corn in this country is being used for corn ethanol right now, which is probably could be replaced by cellulosic ethanol and perennial crops, which could have many, many benefits. So let's hope that that's the way that it goes.
And let me draw another point that Jerry made when to talk about these years with more than 40 inches of rainfall. Those perennial crops that you talk about really benefit when we have those excessive rainfall years, because they use a lot of that water very quickly.
So a different line of questioning, as concerned citizens here in the room today, what can we do as a community to help promote responsible decision making related to sustainability?
Yeah, let Wanda take that one.
let Wanda have the hard ones.
I'm at a loss. I'm at a loss. I guess, it's tough. As a university employee, I mean, we can't advocate with our legislatures, just, for policy reasons. It's a tough one. I think, I'll go back to the preparedness aspect, in terms of policy making and, just having community resilience is a big aspect of that. Get to know your neighbors. Preparedness begins with saying hello, and your neighbors could be your first responders at times, Mm-hmm. And, I think we're all in this together, and I know I don't have a good answer for this, but I think, just personal responsibility and, getting to know your neighbors, community resilience, etc.
Let me give a 30-second answer from my perspective on sustainability and what we've got to do. And I think at times we've got to put it into a risk mitigation, a risk management point of view, so that people understand that when we're not sustainable, that our risk profile really changes and that we become more risk prone in all of this. So I think that's the piece that we've been focusing on is really showing those dynamics of that system, particularly from an agricultural perspective. So.
I might add that, ultimately we have to reduce our emissions. Everyone in Des Moines and Washington, D.C. are keen to talk about, our legislators are keen to talk about so-called adaptation, how we can make our infrastructure more resilient, and that is very important. But still, nobody really wants to talk about mitigation, actually reducing emissions. Marnie Stein this morning gave us a really good depiction of greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. going down, you saw it, through time, and Iowa emissions steady or if anything, increasing, but nobody called us on it. Well, why is that? Are you proud of that, Iowa? That your emissions are going up and the rest of the nation is going down? And who's talking about it? And where is it appearing? It's quite obvious, like the nose on our face, that we have to begin here, each and every one of us, and certainly with programs in the state of Iowa. And at the national level, not only do we need to support government when it does do the right thing. The reason the emissions in the U.S. are going down is because largely fuel efficiency. Our cars are improving at 3 to 4% each and every year. That's an amazing improvement. And our utilities are switching to natural gas and wind. And that's responsible for the decrease in U.S. emissions, yet Iowa continues to increase. We need to ask why that is and what we can do about that at the state level. We need good government. That might be the hardest thing of all to do, because we need a government that recognizes that fossil fuels need to become much more expensive. I'm sorry to say, we need to send a clear signal into the marketplace that if you use fossil fuels and take oxygen out of the air and put carbon dioxide back, you have to pay a price for that. We're going to begin to pay for the externalities and all the costs associated with the fossil fuel age. I'm sorry, but it's been a good run, since the late 1700s, when we first began to burn fossil fuels for the steam engines and so forth. It's provided employment, the engine for economic growth. It's provided heat for our homes and transportation for our cars, but it's over. It's over, and we have to transition to a brand new way of doing things, and what's more, that will be the engine for economic growth in the future, the jobs that are created in moving towards energy efficiency, renewable energy systems for the future. That's how we're going to do it. It doesn't have to be onerous or painful, but it does have to be a transition that we begin to make within the next 10 years. I think we're beginning to run out of time.